Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma. Written by Claire Dederer and published by Knopf Publishing in April of 2023, with a snippet read by Richard Coombs. Available for checkout right now at the Alice Pendleton Library. Roman Polanski. It all began for me in the rainy spring of 2014 when I found myself locked in a lonely, imaginary, battle with an appalling genius. I was researching Roman Polanski for a book I was writing, and I found myself awed by his monstrousness. It was monumental, like the Grand Canyon, huge and void-like, and slightly incomprehensible. On March 10th, 1977, I recite these details from memory, Roman Polanski brought Samantha Gailey to his friend Jack Nicholson's house in the Hollywood Hills. He urged her into the jacuzzi, encouraged her to strip, gave her a quaalude, followed her to where she sat on the couch, penetrated her, shifted his position, penetrated her anally, ejaculated. All of these details piled up, but I was left with a simple fact. Anal rape of a 13-year-old. And yet, despite my knowledge of Polanski's crime, I was still able to consume his work. Eager to. Throughout the spring and summer of 2014, I watched the films, their beauty its own kind of monument, impervious to my knowledge of his crime. I wasn't supposed to love this work, or this man. He was the object of boycotts and lawsuits and outrage. Even so, here I sat in my living room watching Repulsion, Rosemary's Baby, Chinatown. It's hard to imagine a scene of greater coziness and safety. My house sat in the middle of a field, in the middle of the woods, in the middle of an almost entirely crime-free island. The living room faced south and was flooded with light even on the gloomiest Pacific Northwest afternoon. The room was furnished haphazardly, frankly a bit shabbily, and filled with books and paintings. It was the kind of room that would be recognizable the world over as the living quarters of a culture worker, or at least a culture lover. It was a room that suggested, all those books, that human problems could be solved by the application of careful thought and considered ethics. It was a humanist room. I mean, if you were in a certain mood, you could call it a room descended from the Enlightenment. That's a lot for a room to signify, especially when the bookshelves are from IKEA. But it was clear to see, in this room everything could be cured by thinking. That was my mental framework as I settled in to watch the films of Roman Polanski. Really, to solve the problem of Roman Polanski. The problem of loving someone who had done such a terrible thing. I wanted to be a virtuous consumer, a demonstrably good feminist, but at the same time, I also wanted to be a citizen of the world of art, a person who was the opposite of a Philistine. The question, the puzzle, for me, was how I might behave correctly, confronted with these twin and seemingly contradictory imperatives. I felt pretty sure the problem was solvable. I just needed to think harder. I made it through the early films, starting with Knife in the Water, made when he was barely out of art school. I had first seen it as a college student and felt terrified and confused by it. So pretty and so scary. It still felt that way. From there I went on to The Tenant, Repulsion, Rosemary's Baby, Chinatown. All films I had seen many times. I expected them to be radically altered by my deeper knowledge of Polanski's crimes, but that's not exactly what happened. The knowledge just sort of hovered there. Drawn in by the great films from the 1960s and 70s, I watched the newer movies too. The Ghostwriter, a film that seemed to have gone unseen by everyone except film buffs. In it, Ewan McGregor ghostwrites the life story of tycoon Pierce Brosnan, and get this, not all is as it seems. The film ought to be a formulaic thriller, but in Polanski's hands it becomes something weirder and better. In fact, it opens with a shot that made me feel confused and dumb in the face of its very goodness. What made the shot so magnificent, so magistral? It is, after all, a simple image, a lone car in the open mouth of the deck of a ferry, but it's filled with menace. Writing now, I can see the scene in my mind's eye and feel its furious, implacable beauty. Somehow, that Polanski moment, not the Los Angeles River of Chinatown, not the gleeful, menacing chocolate mouse of Rosemary's Baby, not the image of repulsion of Catherine Deneuve crawling down a hallway in her negligee, is what made me really feel his greatness. An unfamous moment in an unfamous film, and it still thrilled me. Even Polanski's throwaway moments shine hard, pearls cast before his detractors. My love of the films did not grow from any forgiveness of his crime. That forgiveness never happened, even though I understood the circumstances and the context. Sex between grown men and teenage girls was normalized at the time, the subject matter of songs and films. Gailey had said she forgives him. Polanski himself was a victim, his mother murdered at Auschwitz, his father held in concentration camps, his wife and unborn child murdered by the Manson family. There's no denying the horror of Polanski's backstory. After all, 2 of the terrors of the 20th century happened to him personally. None of this swayed me towards forgiveness, though. It wasn't as if I weighed the issue and decided that, given these mitigating factors, the crime wasn't so bad after all. The fact was, I simply wanted to watch the films because they were great. I told myself that Polanski was a genius, and that was all there was to it, problem solved. But as I watched, I couldn't ignore something that seemed disturbingly akin to a twinge. More than a twinge, truth be told. My conscience was bothering me. The specter of Polanski's crime wouldn't leave the room. I found I couldn't solve the problem of Roman Polanski by thinking. The poet William Empson said life involves maintaining oneself between contradictions that can't be solved by analysis. I find myself in the midst of one of those contradictions. Polanski would be no problem for the viewer at all, just another example of how some men happen to be black holes if the films were bad. But they're not.